Jessica, please go ahead.
Thanks, Donna. Hi, Tom. I want to ask you something a bit different this time, that's not about anything that's going on. I've been looking into it a lot, and there's lots of opinions and documentaries and myths and legends and stories and stuff. But I was interested in your opinion, or your perspective on the subject of Atlantis.
Well, I haven't kept up with any of that, but I have, of course. You can't be in our culture and not hear about it some ways and sometimes. I can tell you one kind of interesting connection that I ran into that had to do with Atlantis. There was a German writer. I think if I can come up with his name. He was a mystic, one who traveled intuitively. He also was kind of a science person. He started some educational institutions. This was back in probably 1800s. And if his name jumps up to anybody, you can let me know. Maybe I'll think of it as I talk. But he was a pretty famous guy.
Is it Rudolf Steiner?
Yes, it's Rudolf Steiner. Exactly who it is. And anyway, I was listening to a little clip that somebody sent to me of Rudolf Steiner, and he was talking about Atlantis. And he was talking about how there was all of these people who used to have been in a place that was kind of warm and cozy, used to be in a place that worked just fine for them. They were kind of happy the way they were. And then they got shoveled off to another place. They got moved to Atlantis. Or maybe it was from Atlantis. I'm not sure. Maybe they were coming from Atlantis, and that was the nice place. And then they ended up here. Anyway, there was this migration. I don't really remember the details anymore. If you're familiar with Rudolf Steiner, then you probably are aware of it. So either they used to be in a place called Atlantis and they ended up here, or they were here and went to that place. I don't remember. But Atlantis was evolved, and it was this migration, and the migration turned out badly. It was very difficult. And I think they probably were in this place called Atlantis that was where it was so lovely, and they ended up on this earth somehow and were not doing very well. Anyway, as I read that, it was very obvious to me what it was that he was talking about. He was talking about the migration from the big chat room to the entropy reduction simulator that we call the physical universe and Earth. And that all these people who were doing well before, well, they weren't under any stress. They didn't have, there were no hardships. There were no choices that were really had great consequences to them. So everything was just okay. And then they logged on to this entropy reduction simulator, and suddenly there's life and death choices, at every hour of every day. And it was horrible. It was awful. And they struggled and it was, they had this fond memory of this lovely place that they were in, as opposed to this place that they're in now. And because Rudolf Steiner traveled with his intuitive side, various reality frames and whatever, it was clear to me that that's what it was he was talking about. And he called that Atlantis. So Atlantis, I think, is a metaphor for some grand place that was. Often that's the metaphor. Mm-hmm. And it's in our, I was going to say it's in our DNA. It runs very, very deep in not necessarily an individual's memory, but just in the human memory, at the human level, that we made this journey and that there was this other space that we were in, and now we're in this earth space, and it's hard. It's difficult here. And I think you'll find that many indigenous people, I just call them that because they have old cultures, people whose cultures go back 10,000 years, like, the indigenous people in Australia, or perhaps the Maori in New Zealand, or the, American, what we call the American Indians, or whatever. Every place has their people that were there before they were, and had been there for tens of thousands of years before kind of contemporary people moved in and pushed them into small corners. Most of those indigenous people also have in their what should we call them? Not necessarily theologies, but in their mythology, they come from the stars, or they come from a faraway place where things were good and everything made sense, and they got here and it's been a struggle ever since. That kind of an attitude is widely spread all through humanity, no matter what the culture is. So that's my context of Atlantis. Not so much that it was an ancient city on Earth, as it is a concept of a place that worked well and was maybe magnificent, or at least a happy space. And since then, we've been struggling. Now, maybe maybe there is such a place physically, but mostly it seems to be a place in consciousness. It's more conceptual or metaphorical, I think, than it is actual. Now, that's just what I'm thinking at this point. I'm not a student of Atlantis, and I haven't read all the things there are out there about it. But what little I have bumped into it, that's kind of my takeaway.
Thanks, Tom. That's really interesting. But the aspect I find interesting as well is that you mentioned it's a part of our DNA, which might be a bit more expansive on the subject. And also, if it was once an LCS chat room, it must have been a much fancier chat room than the ones we've got now. I don't think anybody's going to leave any modern day chat room and think that they've been in paradise.
No, well, I think things look like paradise only relative to the way they are here. When you look back at something that was not really, really hard and difficult, I think you might start to clothe that in paradise clothing. You might start to think of it in grander terms, just because it wasn't so hard. And I believe that's just part of the metaphor of it being a grand, wonderful space. The fact that it was advanced and all sorts of technology. See, that's our sense. That's our sense of advanced, is advanced technology. So what does advanced mean to a 21st century human? It means advanced technology, all kinds of gee whiz stuff. But that's just our metaphor for advanced. Doesn't necessarily mean that that's the way it is. It's just a modern human's interpretation of advanced.
Thanks, Tom. I appreciate your perspective. Thanks a lot.
Michelle, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Donna. Hi, Tom.
Hello.
I have motivated by the idea that living from my being level, so my life would eventually become a meditation. I've been wondering how well this approach scales. For example, what would happen if in a period of 6 months, 40% of the world population started to behave from their being level, something that they would do at least consistently throughout the days. Mm-hmm. And thinking in this scenario, I couldn't figure out a clear answer, because when we look from a global perspective, we need to deal with the wide range of quality of our consciousness. So I couldn't figure out if such a thing happened in a short period of time, like 6 months, if it would be positive or not. And so my question is if you can give me some educated guess on what you see from such a large and meaningful event.
Okay. From our perspective, from most people's perspective, there's this big kind of gap between the intellectual level and the being level. You have the intellectual level over here, the being level over there, and there's a big difference between them. As you continue to evolve and you become, you've heard me say, you become more and more at the being level, you begin to live your life out of the being level. Well, eventually you take that intellect out of its, out of its imperial castle that it's in charge of everything, running everything, and you make it just become a partner with the intuitive side instead of the boss that has to be in charge. When you do that, then you live at the being level, and your intellect is a cooperative part of that. Your intellect, it's not that when you're in the being level that you can't be intellectual. What we want to do is just get the intellect to not be the dictator, to get the intellect to not be the one in charge. That until the intellect says it isn't true, it isn't right. That the intellect has to vet everything, has to make sure that you're not being foolish, or you're not just imagining something, that what you're doing is real. We get the intellect out of that space of being the judge of everything, and kind of the king that decides what's good and what's not, and make that intellect just a cooperative part of the whole. Then you can work from your being level. Your being level is really who you are, you, the being. It's how you be. Not very good English, but it's just, it's how you are. It's how you be. And that intellect can work there just fine. So now you're connected with people. You're intuitively connected with their feelings, with what they're doing, where they are, where they are. You can see maybe their reality through their eyes, and your intellect can be part of that. So it's not that we need to disown the intellect to get onto the intuitive side, or disown the intuitive side to get into the intellect. What we need to do is get the right balance there, to where the intellect is not the master and the judge of all else, but rather just a cooperative part of the whole. So a massive shift to people living at the being level who are also well balanced, to where their intellect was a part of that being. The intellect's a part of the being. So we use the intellect whenever it's necessary, wherever it's helpful. We don't throw the intellect out. So maybe that is kind of part of what was creating your problem, of thinking that if you're out of the being level, then you're not in your intellect. And the intellect would be kind of, we'd have a whole bunch of people that were a little, they were very intuitive, but not too much a grasp on what was actually happening in their reality. That's not the case. I'm talking about people living out of their being level, because the being is who they are. And that being level now encompasses all of their intuitive side and their intellectual side. And that's who they be, who they are. And it's no longer the intellect trying to control, trying to judge everything. The intellect's just one of the resources, and it gives credibility to the intuitive side, works with the intuitive side, doesn't judge it. So in that case, I don't see that there'd be any problem. I think if we had a whole lot of people who were balanced in their, had their intuitive side, just lived out of the being level with their intellect as part of their resources to be used as needed, then I think that would be a really positive thing. I don't see any trouble at all.
Maybe it has to do with perhaps a misunderstanding from my side. If we have someone that hasn't evolved much, and this person starts living, or at least stop acting, wouldn't those choices be represented on probably potentially harmful behavior? I sometimes notice that people, although they may not seem to be behaving, well, let's say very good, but I feel like they are already acting to a good level. If they were to do what they truly intended, they would be brutal. So I'm thinking not just those that are working to evolve, to grow up, to get to being level, but I was thinking in an event that without choice, mostly randomly, everyone would, in this group, like a large group, 40%, would start behaving, essentially stop acting. They would be truly what they are at the level that they are. And that's what I was caught up.
All right. Yes, that's the case. Acting, being kind and acting kind are very different, but acting kind is civilizing. If everybody acts kind, then we're at a whole lot more civil society than if they don't act kind. And you're saying if everybody who was acting kind just suddenly didn't act kind anymore because they really weren't kind, then that would be a problem. Yes, if you could just make that switch, then I would agree with you. That would create some sort of a difficulty. But the point is that people who are acting kind are only kind when people are watching. That's what acting is all about. It's for others. I guess acting can be for yourself as well, but for many people, it's more about others, and that acting only, it's a thin veneer on the surface. I mean, that's the way it is when we go to work, right? We go to work, and at work, we know we don't talk about religion. We don't talk about, anything that's real controversial. Keep your mind focused on the work and don't create any problems. So there's certain things you just don't talk about at work, things that are controversial, because that interrupts getting work done, right? So we go to work and everybody's nice. Everybody cooperates, we all get along, we interact. And the fact that all those people at work are suppressing all kinds of attitudes, feelings, and things that they're just not saying. And if they said something about those, well, the workplace would dissolve into a big, root of arguments and fussing and people not liking each other and making, picking sides, and it just degenerate. So we have this more civil place at work where we don't get into personal issues. We just do our job. So yes, there's a reason for that kind of a rule, but people are who they are. They act when they go to work, but when they go home, they're who they are. When they're in their familiar surroundings, they're generally the way they are. If they're not a kind person, they may be real kind at work and say please and thank you and be nice to everybody. But when they go home, if they're not a kind person, then they holler at the kids, kick the dog, and are not nice because that's the way they are. So yes, I think that if everybody stopped acting nice, the place would devolve pretty quickly into a lot of fussing and arguing that would be dysfunctional. So all of that acting is civilizing, no doubt. But these people who act at work generally are not acting away from work or among their friends. Maybe at work, they work with people from other races and they work just fine with them. And maybe they go home with their racist friends and they just, say all kinds of things that they'd never show at work. Well, that's at least civilizing at work. But people are who they are. You can't fake it all the time everywhere. That just would drive you nuts. You fake it for a while in certain places, mostly places where other people are. So yeah, I would agree with you. If suddenly everybody who's pretending to be kind who isn't, if they suddenly stop pretending, the thin veneer of civilization would crack rather severely. But I don't think that will happen. In a way, it would perhaps be a catharsis to make us kind of take stock of who we are really and deal with things that now just kind of slip under the surface. So one way you might think it would be a really good thing, but we'd first have to get through it and everybody be forced to deal with it at that point. And whether that means a lot of people would grow up or a lot of people would start fighting, it's kind of hard to say. If a lot of people ended up fighting, then it wouldn't be a good thing. If a lot of people grew up because they realized the magnitude of the problem, then it would be a good thing. So it's kind of hard to say how that would work out, but it's not something that is actually likely to happen because that's really not the social situation that we're in now. Probably 1,000 years ago, that was the social situation. Probably hardly anybody ever acted. Everybody probably just was about the way they were. But now not so much. Our culture and socialization has created a lot of norms for us to live up to daily.
Thank you.
Andreas was next.
Thanks, Donna. Hi, Tom. My question is about meditation. Meditation with binaural beats, power breathing, and Tom Spark. The most data I get from the system after a meditation with the binaural beats and not during it. Unfortunately, not every time, but more and more. And I meditate twice a day for about 20 minutes, 40 minutes, and using the techniques I just mentioned. So I try to leave my training wheels of the bike, so the binaural beats. And in your experience, what would be the best combination of techniques to get data from the system, Tom Spark and the power breathing, and would you prefer to change the techniques daily, or would you rather stick with one?
Well, that depends on you or on the individual. Just the techniques that work best for you and what's going to help you learn depends exactly on who you are and what your experience is, what you're ready for. I would say treat it as an experimental science. Try different things, see what works best. If it works better with the binaural beats, then use them, but continually sample without them and see how that works. But as you try different things, you can't just try something once and that isn't a sufficient test of that thing. You have to try it and work it for about a week or so and then see how that works. If you just try it once, most everything that's new is probably not going to work because things that you're not used to aren't going to work as well as things that you are used to. So you have to get over that problem. So try different things, use them for at least a week or two, and then try different things and use those for a week or two. Yes, that's a slow process. It may take you many months before you start to converge on what's best for you. But even, let's say 3 months later, you converge on what really works best for you. Well, then use that for another 3 months and then start changing again. Start adding new things to it. And if those new things after a few weeks don't work, go back to what you had. So it's just constantly a trial and error process for you, because what is best for you today won't necessarily be best for you, 6 months from now. It'll change as you change. as your mind, your attitude, you change even from day to day. Every time you do a meditation, it's a little different. Your experience isn't just a repeat of what you had before. Everyone's a little different because every time you sit down and start a meditation, you're a little different. You come at it from a little different thing with different things on your mind. It's always in constant flux, Andreas. So just treat it as an experimental science that where the answer is in constant flux, because that's indeed the way it is. So there isn't any set answer for any particular individual. And I say that thinking through all the different kind of phases that I had gone through, as I started this process. I had all kinds of practices and things that really worked great here, and then they didn't work anymore. And then you do something else, and later you do something else, and it just always changes. So you always have to be open to trying new things, give them a chance, and then if they don't work out too well, then leave them. But shoot, a year later or 2 years later, maybe you want to try them again, because things that didn't work may work now. And you'll have to decide, is it just because it works because you just happen to be in the right mood and the right frame of mind today, and that's why it works so good? Or is it really something that the technique is better? And all of those questions will only produce answers with time and experimentation. So there is no fixed way, really. It's whatever works. And then when you find things that work, you're always pushing the boundary of the envelope. You always want to go a little further. So you're always experimenting. Even if you got a really good system that works, well, that's fine. But now you want to see if you can't do something better. So it's always a trial and error process from beginning to end, and that doesn't ever change. I don't think you'll ever get to a point where you say, this is it. I'll just do this, and that's the optimum. At least I've never found that. I've never found that true. That's true for a few months, maybe even 6 months, maybe even a year. That's true, but that's not true in the long term. So you just stay open and flexible and see how it works. As long as your intent is to continue to grow and to optimize your experience, you'll eventually get into the right groove and then hop to the next one and the next one when it's ready. I've always found if you're just open and let things happen as they do, they almost always happen optimally when you do that. And in as much as you try to make it happen the way you think it should, they're almost always suboptimal that way, because the intellect doesn't really know what it's doing. It's guessing mostly. So it's best to just admit that and have a very open mind and just let things come to you as they come to you. You'll get intuition that says, well, maybe I should try this, or maybe I need to do this. And that intuition is often very good. Sometimes not. So sorry I can't be of any definitive, use to you, but I can tell you that it's very much dependent on who you are at the moment that you sit down to meditate as to what's going to work best for you. And all meditation sessions are not, equally valuable. Sometimes you'll meditate and it'll be that, all I did there is pass a little time. I'm nice and relaxed. I feel better now. Good. And other ones are going to be, wow, that was amazing. They're all not going to be, wow, that's amazing. Some of them are going to be that way, but they're not all going to be that way. And that's okay. Let the ones that are just nice, relaxing times just be nice, relaxing times. Don't say, must have done something wrong because it wasn't wow and amazing. Just let it be however it is. And you'll probably make your fastest progress that way without pushing on it too hard.
Thank you very much, Tom.
Go ahead, Leo.
Hi, Tom. I had a bunch of other questions, but then something happened in my life, so my question changed. My dad passed away 2 weeks ago, quite suddenly. And it brought up to mind all kinds of thoughts and ruminations. And I did do the binaural beats. And I asked the LCS to let me speak to my dad. And I actually saw him when he was young. And he spoke to me, and he had like a light beam next to him. And I know that you always say that it doesn't really matter if it's our imagination or if it's actually things. So I didn't really, thought about it too much. But it was a very intense experience, and that made me think. I know you always say that the soul or the individual unit of consciousness just moves on. And even if we do connect with it or see it, it's not necessarily the person, but the kind of the LCS just, I don't know, showing us the person, playing the person.
Mm-hmm.
But it made me think, I mean, I kind of know, I guess I know the answer to that, but I still wanted to get your perspective on it. It's just when we live here, it's so important to us, our relationships and the people that we marry, and we have kids and we have friends. And while we're here, it's so important to us. And it always sounds so cruel to me that once the soul just moves on to the next incarnation, they just leave everything behind. And all the people here, like my mother, was completely broken for a few days. And I'm like, okay, so is my dad now just frolicking in in a non-physical space, and then just going to while we here just just devastated by it? Do the souls that just move on have any interest or connection or about their former lives? Like if like my dad died, would his soul care about my mother and about us, and we grow up and to see us growing up? Because I know it was very important to him what I do with my life and what I do. So it's just like once they're transitioning, they're like they're off to their next game, and then we're just here, just staying with it. And I'm like, it's almost like two separate, well, I know it is two separate, not totally separate, but completely different partitions of the same system. And it's like, it seems natural because I know that's how it works, but it all seems so cruel. And I always hear that sometimes some souls come together because one soul wants to play the spouse and one soul wants to play the kid. But then if like my father leaves and I stay here, and let's say me and my father came here as two souls and want to play this parts together, well, now I'm here by myself. So where's that contract? What happened to that contract? It's just like, well, how in the context of our life here, how does the soul who moves on from their perspective, how do they look at it?
Okay. From their perspective, immediately after they die, they are very much still aware of where they just came from and what they just left. That kind of depends on the circumstances of their death and how, whether the death is sudden or what. But that begins to fade, as I say, like a dream. So it starts out as of utmost importance, and before long, it's mostly forgotten. So yes, that hits a lot of people as being, well, you say cruel, but as being cold and prickly and not the warm, cuddly, kind of feelings that we have for each other. But the memory and all the information that defines that person is still there. And if you want to interact with that person, you can interact with them as you have. And that interaction is real, of course. Now, whether it was them as a piece of the larger conscious system or them as a different piece, as the LCS, another piece of the larger conscious system, really doesn't matter that much. It's still them. So in that way, they live on in the sense that they can be recreated to interact as necessary, as they can be helpful, as it's useful. Your mom can also connect with her husband. She can make that connection, and not just once or twice, but she can make that connection every day the rest of her life if she wants. It's there. So there is that connection that goes on. And there isn't anything that's fake about that. That's a very real connection. But the consciousness, the IUOC, that was, had that free will awareness unit that was your father, had this experience packet. The experience packet's over. And now that IUOC is going to make another free will awareness unit and become another individual someplace else with family and brothers and sisters and wives and children, and going to love every one of them very much. And after that one's over, it's going to incarnate some other place and have brothers and sisters and wives and children and love every one of them very much. Because we have these relationships because we need to practice being loving. We need to practice being positive. We need to practice getting rid of our fear and our ego. And we have to do that, in all of our experience packets. So it's just the nature of how it is that we evolve. And to want to hang on to the past and not let it go, keep that past going forever, is just not productive to growing up. It's just not it's not the optimal way to grow. If it were the optimal way to grow, then we just have one lifetime, and we'd all be immortal and all live just one life. And we'd make friends and have wives and children, and that'd be it. We just stay that way, never die. It's not efficient. It's not an effective way for people to grow up. So that's not the way the system works. And only from our small perspective here in the little picture does that seem cruel, or does that seem sad. From a bigger picture, nothing's ever lost. Nothing's ever lost. You can connect to the father you had 2 lifetimes ago if you want to. You can still make that connection. Nothing's ever lost. You see, it's still there if you want to make that connection and have an exchange. And it's not a fake thing. It is exactly the way your father 2 lifetimes ago would have been. It's just not a separate being that's been hanging out for 150 years for you to have a question or to want to make the contact. That's just not very efficient way to run a system, you see. So it's there, and I know it's an emotional thing. You're emotionally attached. This death is a recent passing, and you feel that tug of wanting things to be the way they were, wanting things to always stay the same. But it's not how it works. And how your father thinks about it is he thinks less and less about it as time goes on, and pretty soon, that's retired. His IUOC is now, a little Chinese girl someplace, next to, at the border of Mongolia, raising chickens.
Just so wild to think about this stuff. It's just like, I'm thinking, I thought about it myself, like, my father is now a Chinese girl, and I'm like, what? It's just so crazy. But like what you say about, we can connect, but let's be honest here, most people don't know how to connect and don't know how to do it. So for us, for the players here, I think this is one of the biggest challenges that we have, is how to accept that part of life, because this person was here. It's not like that. No, he was not a healthy person. It happened suddenly, but he was like 74 and had issues, but it just happened suddenly. And it was very difficult for me to consult to like to console my mother, you know, it's like she would unconsolable. She lived with him for 50 years. And I tried to tell her about some MBT concepts that I know of and that helped me immensely, but she doesn't believe in reincarnation. It's hard for her to believe in reincarnation. So what can you do? So it's like, I know I saw him, I had the meditation and I saw him, I spoke to him. So this actually got to her. And she actually thanked me for saying that. But I know there's no real separation. Like if I talk to the LCS or to the actual father, it's the same thing. But it's just the game is rigged for us in such a almost, it's one of the biggest challenges that we have to do here. It just, to me, and just think about reincarnation, about like this person that you knew so well, it's just a completely different person now.
Yeah. Those are attachments. We get attached to things and we don't want things to change. We're attached to them the way they are and we want to hang on to them. But that is not, you know, we don't live forever, we die, and hanging on forever is just counterproductive, won't help us evolve. So yes, it is a difficult thing for people to deal with. And no, you cannot console somebody by, you know, telling them intellectually, oh, it's all right, you know, dad's moved on and it'll be fine. And, you know, that's not going to help anybody because that's an intellectual thought. That doesn't change them at the being level. That doesn't change their grief any. But people want things to stay. You know, if things are good, then they want it to always be that way. It's an attachment to those things, and we get attached. Our ego is attached. They fulfill our needs. Our needs are attached. And that's part of growing up. And that's the part of this life. You know, it's in a cycle. So you start out and you're very young and you're very self-centered and you know, you're the master of the universe. And then the more you grow, the smaller and smaller you get. By the time you're older, you realize there's so much that you don't know. And you move on, do other things. So you just have to have a big picture, and it's easy to slip into that little picture where it's painful, but you need the bigger picture in order to really understand how the system works. And it's really a beautiful system. It's not it's not an uncaring system. It's just, we get attached with our egos and our needs, and it's hard to let go. Yes, it's difficult to grow up. Growing up is not easy. That's why it takes such a long time. Evolution is a slow process, but there it is. And you know, it doesn't make it any easier for your mom or for you. Well, it probably makes it some easier for you because you have a bigger picture. That won't help your mom much, but she'll have to deal with it. She'll have to realize that he's not here, that she has to, you know, there's other things that are still here that she still needs to connect with and still needs to do. And she will eventually move on and miss him probably forever, but that's okay. She'll become functional again and it'll all work itself out. All part of the learning process.
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead, Sydney.
Hi, Tom. Nice to see you.
Oh, good to see you again, Sydney. It's been a while.
It's been a while. I'm always struggling with fear one way or another, and I know that I'm supposed to go toward it. And so recently, when I've been feeling experiences of fear, I allow myself to feel it and not shy away from it and try not to get into the intellectual part of what I'm supposed to do about it. But I need some other tools to help me reduce it, or, you know, yes, go toward it, but what else? Or do you have any tools that would help me to reduce it or deal with it in other ways?
So the going toward it is basically not running from it, accepting it, you know, not being chased away by it, letting it be, accepting, say, okay, there it is. I do have this fear, and it's there. When you don't run from it, you don't have to reach out and give it a hug. You don't have to do that. You can do that. You can just accept it, but mostly not running is the idea. Don't run away from the fear. Stay there, be with it, and realize that it's there. Then have an intention, Sydney, to reduce that fear. Okay, the fear's this big now, and you want to reduce it to just that big. And then you want to reduce it to just that big. Try to reduce it. Maybe that'll be a thing, rather than get rid of it altogether. Maybe it's just too big a step. Maybe you can just reduce it and say, well, I'm just not going to feel that fear so strongly. I'll feel it a little bit. And when I do, I'll recognize it and say, yeah, I know you're there. Sit down. I'm going to outgrow it, and try to reduce it a little bit at a time. So that's one thing to do. And secondly, is to keep your intent focused somewhere in the back of your mind all the time. Is, I don't want to have that fear. I don't want that fear. I want to outgrow it. I want it to be gone. I want to live a life without it. And you can even imagine yourself not having that fear, coming up to the situation and not having fear when that situation occurs. And just keep that in your mind. And if you can keep that up in your mind all the time, I don't want to be that way. I don't want to have that fear. Then it will just go away on its own, just from that thought will modify the future probability, and that fear will shrink. And that's because as long as you have that idea up there, you'll do all the right things at the right times. You'll feel that fear coming on, and you'll immediately say, well, okay, it's there. I recognize it. That's me, but not so much. And eventually it'll go away. So I think if you're trying to struggle with the whole fear, it's just a little much. It's hard for you to grab hold of that and deal with it. It's probably been one you've been carrying around for such a long time that it's a little hard just to rip it up by the roots and throw it away, because those roots are still there. So in that case, just make it smaller and smaller and smaller. See yourself without it. Have in your mind a picture of coming up to that situation that triggers that fear, and it just doesn't trigger. Feel that, walk through that in your imagination. And that will help too. That'll help you see and feel how it is to be without that fear. And then let that feeling grow while the other feeling shrinks. Try that.
I like that. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.